I guess we are ready to go. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bassam Haddad. I am the founding director of the Middle East and Islamic Studies program at George Mason University and an associate professor at the Shar School, also at George Mason. And I'm thrilled to be here to address one of the important moments of the day that is taking place in Iran. And we are more than thrilled, actually, to have with us an array of remarkable scholars who will address this matter under the title of In Her Name, Women Rising, State Violence, and the Future of Iran. I have with me my fantastic co-host, Negar Razavi, whom I'll introduce in just a minute. But let me first say that this event is co-sponsored by the Shar School, the Middle East and Islamic Studies Program, the Arab Studies Institute, and the Abu Sulaiman Center for Global Islamic Studies, all at George Mason University. And I am looking forward to this discussion. I will not say very much because I know that many of you are looking to hear from our speakers. I will introduce them because we do have an array of 5 speakers that I will share their very brief bio with you. First, let me say hi, Nigar. So Nigar, my co-host and co-moderator, Nigar Razavi is a public humanities research associate at the Kaplan Institute at Northwestern. Her work focuses on the intersections of security, expertise, gender, humanitarianism, and the U.S. policies toward the Middle East. We will also be speaking, of course, or hearing from all of our guests, and they are Arzu Osanlu. Please feel free to correct my pronunciation. Arzu is professor in the Department of Law, Societies and Justice, and the director of the Middle East Center at the University of Washington. Her work examines the formations of women's rights and human rights in cultural contexts and draws on ethnographic fieldwork in Iran. Her first book was entitled The Politics of Women's Rights in Iran. Hi, Arzu. Next, we have Catherine Zahra Sameh, is an associate professor of gender and sexuality studies at UC Irvine. Her book, Axis of Hope, Iranian Women's Rights Activism Across Borders, situate Iranian women's rights activism within the long-standing tension between Iran and the United States. Hello, Catherine. Next, we have Furur Farhang. Please also correct my pronunciation. She is an advanced doctoral candidate in anthropology at Northwestern University. Her research examines war and conflict, displacement and mobility, and borderland in the Middle East. Hi, Furur. Next is our own Manije Nasrabadi is a scholar and founding member of the Raha Iranian Feminist Collective and also a co-editor of the Iran page on Jadaliyya. Hi, Manije. It's good to see you. It's good to see you all. It's just that I know you a little bit more. And then finally, we have Nahid Siamdust, whom we've had on our various events in the past. Nahid is assistant professor of Middle Eastern Studies at UT Austin. She examines issues of transnational cultural production, politics, media in and beyond Iran. Her book, Soundtrack of the Revolution, examined the power of music and cultural production more broadly in Iran in creating political alignments and forms of dissent within the country's political sphere. Hi, Nahid. How are you? Welcome back. And let me now move to giving the floor to my co-moderator, Negar, who will be initiating the conversation. Welcome all. We will be here for about 90 minutes, and I am not sure if we will be able to have a Q&A later on because of the length of this event, but we will sort of play this by ear. Negar, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Bassam, and thank you to our speakers and to everybody who's tuning in right now, wherever you are. This is really a timely event, and I just want to, before I jump into the questions, mention that we're not going to go into sort of the basics of what have happened over the past 2 weeks. We are going to dive into some of the context and to put what is happening right now in a broader historical, cultural, legal, and even global context. But if you are looking for sort of a very brief description of what's happening, Nahid did a wonderful 5-minute interview on NPR that I would highly recommend if you just want to understand sort of the basic facts of what is going on right now in Iran and why people are out on the streets. So with that, I want to turn to our first question, which is that Iranian women have been organizing and demanding rights for well over a century in very meaningful and powerful ways. The very first mass-scale protest after the establishment of the Islamic Republic was the Women's March Against Compulsory Hijab. Iranian women were on the front lines of the student protests in the 90s, again in 2009 with what was called the Green Movement. And since then, they've been very active in various ways. And we'll get into some of that history during this discussion. So my first question for our speakers is, what's different or unique about the protest this time? And I won't direct it to a specific person. So if you wanna, whoever wants to take up that first question, go ahead.
I can take that on, unless Furu, would you like to go first?
Go for it.
Okay, this is just sort of my bit, and I'm sure we can all sort of contribute to what is different this time. But I think what is different this time, we've seen sort of this arc over the last, 5 years or so, where hopes for reform really have come to a dead end within the Islamic Republic, in part because of the greater sort of, engineering of the elections. And of course, this is on the heels of a pandemic, years of severe economic sanctions by the US. So generally, this is coming at a time when people have been doing very badly economically, socially, politically. There have been greater repressions. And of course, with the election of Raisi, there have been now weeks since July of a much more sort of, increased presence of the morality police. And we've seen videos of state violence against women mediated on social media. And this is something that women have been seeing and people have been seeing over the course of the last month or two. And of course, also the whole incident, I think, with Sepide Rashno was really important, that sort of scuffle that happened on the bus, and the state media's presentation of Sepide on state media to sort of apologize to the Chadori woman whom she had apparently attacked. And I think it's sort of, the culmination of years, but also sort of this pressurized sort of 2 months of humiliation and greater repression against women. And so what's different, I think, is all of these elements coming together. And of course, Mahsa Amini, the 22-year-old who was killed, being of Kurdish ethnicity. I think that really mattered, because the slogan Janjian Azadi has been existing within the Kurdish realm for several years now. And so the fact that sort of, that could unite people across Iran, not just on gender issues, but on sort of overarching issues, and connect these different provinces and ethnicities, has also contributed to to this moment.
I can take it from here, because I can just add a few other historical moments that I think mattered in the way that made this specific protest unique. And I think like going about what Negar and Nahid are talking about in terms of historical significance, and the historical part being highlighted in the significance of these events, I think we can read this new wave of Iranian women's movement towards liberation, basically, and I don't want to call it freedom for reasons that I hope we will get to, is to read it within two different contexts. One would be the Iranian women's liberation movement, not only in the last 4 decades, but actually going back to the 1905 constitutional revolution, Mashruteh, and from there taking it through all these basically years and decades of struggle that are not necessarily against the Islamic rule, but it's much bigger, and it's about patriarchal rule. And I think this is one of the things that connects the movement very clearly to a more international anti-establishment, anti-patriarchal movement that we will be most probably talking about later on. And one other thing is going back to Nahid's point about specifically the last 5 decades of socioeconomic struggle that has been highlighted in different ways. And I think, again, going back to Mahsa Amini's figure, the very unfortunate events and the journey she went through, but also galvanizing this event in a way that it kind of connects Saqqez, a town in the borderland of Kurdistan with Iraq, and bringing together not only generations of women who have been going through this different, but also like very similar issues, and at the same time bringing in generations of men from different ethnic minorities, really like also self-identified religious and non-religious groups of people, and also connecting into students organizations that have been going on forever, but also the last 5 years, connecting to the labor unions, teachers, bus driver syndicates, teachers, and also factory workers unions. And I think these are very important connections to make to understand how this is unique, because basically Mahsa Amini became this thread that connected not only women, generations of women, but also all these other people who have been part of this struggle throughout. But now they found this moment to be under the banner of Jen Jian Azadi, or from Kurdish being translated to Farsi, and then now to the English of woman life freedom, and kind of bringing everyone together. So I think what's unique about it is that it was generalizable to bring in kind of like an all-encompassing segments of Iranian society together.
Yeah, I would like to just speak to some of that, and I agree with Forough and Nahid. And there's also some attention to be made to this idea that there isn't a call for Khatami to come out and represent, or Mir Hossein Mousavi. So some people are calling this leaderless, some people are calling it spontaneous. But what I think is really important is that there's a very straightforward attention to the issues related to women. And historically, going all the way back, as Forough says, to the 1905 revolution, we have seen women's issues being oftentimes used as a spark to gain their ability, to join in, but at the same time, their issues have been sidelined. First, let's get the revolution, then we'll deal with women's issues. And what's happening here, because of the coalescing, as Forough mentioned, of so many different issues around this lightning rod event, is that there is a very important stress and attention on the compulsory aspect of women's bodily comportment, the need for autonomy, and that is maintained, and it is center stage. And I think that's very important. And just the last thing about this is that I do research in Iran. I go every year, and I was there in 2000 with the student protests and the closing of the newspapers. And one thing that was really striking to me this time, as opposed to that time, was a journalist friend was covering the events, and he interviewed, he was recounting to me an event that he witnessed during the protests, where a woman was screaming and pulling at her hijab and saying, in 20 years, this was 20 years ago, this is all you've given us. And he came to my house and he told me he witnessed this, and he said, but people aren't willing to die for this. And now 20 years later, this is exactly what's happening. And so we have to go back to the question, what's changed? And I think some of the things that Nahid said about the economic strains, Forough mentioned the maximum pressure and the sanctions, have really come together to coalesce around this really big event, but it also has many vectors that contribute to it.
Yeah, if I can jump in, I think, I've been talking to a lot of different Iranians, in diaspora in Iran, and there's a million different points of view and opinions, but I hear so many people saying, I have dreamed of this. I have been waiting my whole life for this, and so I think we have to really underscore the fact that, this is a far more radical movement, wave of protest, uprising than what we've seen in the past. And, that this is a unified determination that a government that harasses and arrests and tortures and kills women for so-called improper hijab must go. So absolutely, people are at the place, as many of you said, where reform does not seem viable or even desirable, right? The demand is for an end to the Islamic Republic form of government, an end to theocracy. And I think that is massively significant, right? That the issue of patriarchy, patriarchal authoritarianism, patriarchal state violence has been at the center of this, and has been the point of unity, as folks said, that can bring all the other issues, all the pressure and frustration with all of the other issues to the breaking point. And I also think that it brings together the issue of persecution of women and persecution of ethnic and religious minorities, right? Because of course, Jina Amini was Kurdish. And so this is a moment where I think there's an outpouring of multiple grievances, right, against this government. But the fact that it's crystallized around the issue of women's bodily autonomy and equality is so important for the reasons Arzu and others said, because that issue again and again was deemed secondary, right? Was always to be postponed and deferred. So I think it opens up really tremendous possibilities for thinking about what a feminist alternative, right, might look like in Iran, and the fact that that's even on the table, because in the 2009 Green Uprising, which mobilized many of us, in solidarity at that time, it was a struggle for Iranian feminists in Iran to make these issues legible at that time. I remember some friends tried to go with signs and try to bring the issue of, women's equality into that moment, and nobody wanted to hear about it. It just was not there. It wasn't resonating, right? So that to me is just a phenomenal shift. I'm really echoing what everybody else said, but yeah.
Gosh, I mean, I don't know that I have anything more to add. I feel like every point has been wonderful. I think we'll get into this in the course of the discussion, but I think one of the things that's so important is the question of bodies in space in a new kind of way. And this is, the kind of bodily conscription that the state requires of everyone in every society, in different kinds of ways. And I think we have, some of us, I'll include myself, have been hesitant to focus too much on the body, because the body is so overdetermined, and particularly in Iran, women's bodies, and hijab has been overdetermined in some quarters. But to think about what this represents as a kind of, how our bodies unruly in protest, dissenting in different kinds of ways, and we can connect this also to all of the things that have been going on, right? The pensioners' protests in July around inflation, and the fact that they're saying our tables are empty, right? So the body in need, the body under siege in all of these different ways, the body demanding new kinds of care and new kinds of ways of being together. And I think that raises a lot of interesting questions and possibilities. And this feels also like something that's very global, right? The kinds of ways in which bodies are both conscripted, right? A compulsion of bodies to do many things, like kill other people in the military, right? So I hope we can also get into that too.
Absolutely. And I'm taking copious notes, and I already have a few things that I think we can circle back to in some of the questions that are coming our way. But I think for a lot of people who are watching the protests from the outside, there's confusion about who is on the streets, who is protesting, what are their goals, because of media blackouts. I mean, it's very intentional why there's confusion. So for people who aren't Persian speakers or who don't have people on the ground who can help them navigate what's happening, I think a a lot of times the protesters or who is protesting gets very abstracted, flattened. We just see them as one large mass with a unified mission and central goals that are very clear. And I hope to sort of like dig deeper into that. And so maybe we'll start with Furul this time to just say, you know, who are the protesters? Do they all have the same vision of what they want in terms of, let's put like the larger political structure out there, but also even in terms of women's rights? Like we're saying in the previous question, all of you are really highlighting what's unique about this is that women's rights are really centered. Are the protesters, do they share the same vision of even what gender equality or, you know, what they want to see for women in the society? Do we see any sort of unity in terms of what is being demanded on the streets? So Furul, if you want to take that first.
Sure. Yeah. Great question, because I think we all have the tendency, not only the Western liberal media, but we all have the tendency to give one image that we think we would serve basically the future of the uprising. And I do not want to do that, even though I have the tendency to do that as well. I would rather read the uprising within the socioeconomic context of it. I would rather see it as part of the bigger movement that is under the banner of woman, life, freedom, but is actually seeking something beyond that, which would be like bringing together socioeconomic, civil aspects of our lives that have been constraints in a lot of ways together. But at the same time, I think not to flatten that image, for 40 years, when you have this binary image of oppression versus freedom, not only fueled into the society by the Western media, but also by the regime itself. So both parties are feeding this image of oppression versus freedom, East versus West. And we all know the na sharqi na gharbi ba Jamhuriya Islami, no to the West, no to the East, but the Islamic Republic being the way that kind of like Islamic Republic was trying to differentiate itself from any form of like, let's say, Western or Eastern, like socialist or capitalist parties that existed back then. And one of them is already gone. I think like what we need to do is to actually get to the grassroots and see the multiplicity that is happening in there. And some of that would actually fit into the image that the liberal Western media is trying to present. We have the Masih Alinejad, and we have her supporters in Iran. Let's not forget that. But at the same time, what I think needs to be added to that image to make it less flattened is to remember Masih Alinejad in her own context, in Voice of America, in her pictures being taken with Pompeo, and her support of Trump, who later received where kind of like it took the American society's anti-abortion kind of like, you know, like movement. So I think this is part of the image. One other image that we do not see, that does not come out of Iran, is where you have all those women from not necessarily the center, but actually the so-called periphery of the Iranian state, which would be in the borderlands. And now that connection is being made in the last 11 days, and only in the last 11 days. So I guess what is important here is to not forget about that multiplicity and let the multiplicity that is meeting on the streets itself be voiced, and not to read something or impose a reading or interpretation upon it, but actually take those conversations out of that context and be like, these are the conversations that are happening between student organizations which are usually considered the progressive women's and kind of like young left-wing movements. And those people are now in conversation with unions, with people in the streets, with basically women who would watch Voice of America, who would basically get their information from BBC Persian. And there's nothing wrong with any of this. It's just like making this conversation finally happen, and all these stigmas being put aside, and then seeing what we can add to each other's conversations, basically. So I think like if we keep that in mind, but at the same time not flatten the multiplicity that already existed and now is being voiced to, I think it would give a much better image of what's going on right now.
Nahi, do you want to jump in on that question as well?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. I agree with Furul about the multiplicity, but I think this is going back to the first question that when we talk about what's unique, and other speakers have pointed to this, it's that, there's now this sort of percolation of this bare truth that women's freedom, women's choices to dress as they wish and to live the lives that they wish, is intimately connected to the freedom of the nation as a whole. And that, I think, is the truly unique aspect of these, of these protests versus the ones that happened previously. And as Manijeh, I think, said, women's sort of the hijab, not least because women didn't, especially, feminists, both in Iran and outside of Iran, didn't really want to engage with this Western obsession of the hijab. And so for, something like 40 decades, it's true, they've been saying the hijab is secondary. That is, let's just put it on the back burner. That's not important. And I think what's happening now, it's this realization because of sort of, 4 years or so leading up to this, because of images we've seen, because of the Girls of Revolution Street and so on, the sort of bare truth that there won't be freedom from repression unless women have their freedom. So there is multiplicity, but whether we're talking about feminists inside Iran or outside, protesters on the streets, elsewhere, I think that is the one understanding they have. And otherwise, there's, as far as the hijab is concerned, I think there have been several polls. Rouhani's government had a poll in 2018, I believe, where even the government's reported results were that 49% of Iranians were against compulsory hijab. There was an independent survey in 2020, the results of which were that 72% of Iranians are against compulsory hijab. So we've kind of been leading up, building up to this moment. And so on that issue, I think there seems to be sort of, widespread agreement.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting is, nobody knows how things are going to play out, but I think what's really interesting is I hear a lot of people saying, we won't simply like imagine that the Iranian government said, okay, no more mandatory hijab. That's no longer enough. That's no longer going to cut it, because as you said, Nahid, people understand that as a kind of nexus point, right, for the larger authoritarian structures of state violence and surveillance and control, and for the and as a quintessential or crystallizing symbol of all of the various oppressions, right, that are going on. So I think that is the significant difference as well, right, is I don't think people are really willing to accept like a concession around one thing, right? They want total systemic transformation of their society. Yeah.
I'll just add, I also think, this question of sort of who's out there on the street is really important, but I also think as in every movement, there is a question of the kind of penetration of resistance and protest and we're tired of what's been happening for many, many, many years. We're tired of the ways in which, Islam is spoken in our name, for instance, right? So that, I think there is a multiplicity, there's a penetration of sort of broad-based support of this movement, even if some people aren't out on the streets. And that's always true, I think, in these kinds of uprisings, right? The ways in which they, are percolating everywhere, right? The sentiment, the feeling, but there might only be certain bodies out there at certain times, although it's also true that lots of people are out on the streets.
That actually segues perfectly into our next question, Catherine. I don't know if you did that on purpose, but I think we sort of jumped into the deep end of what's happening in the present moment, and we've made allusions to the past in the broader context. But now let's take a moment to actually do that work of broadening and understanding and deepening at the same time. So while the street and the visuality of the protests, i.e., burning headscarves, cutting your hair, these things they're purposefully very powerful symbolic actions. They draw much of the attention globally and within Iran itself. And we'll get into the Western coverage toward the end of our discussion. But women have been struggling for their rights in Iran on multiple levels, in various forms, in legal ways, in cultural ways, in political ways, And I think this is a great opportunity because we have experts who have studied these things to sort of unpack some of that for us. So I'm going to direct this first part of the question to Arzu. Can you talk a bit about how women in Iran have been struggling or fighting for their rights through political and legal channels? You can kind of go as far back as you'd like in that question. We can go back to Mashrutia or even before that if you want, or we can stick to the post-Islamic Republic.
Thank you. Let me just start with the 1979 revolution, and then we can go back or forwards. But I think that you mentioned the visuality and this visual symbol of women, declining or resisting the headscarf. And we also saw similar symbols of that going back to the early 80s, at 1979, the March 6th, the women's movements in the streets. And we have to remember, though, that the Iranian Revolution, people call it an Islamic revolution, but before that, it was actually, it included considerable support and involvement from the left, whether it was the religious left or the secular left. And it turned out that what brought them together was an anti-imperialism and an anti-capitalism that aligned many of the values along with toppling a monarchy. And just comparing this to the coverage of the Queen's death in England shows you just how revolutionary Iran's movement now is. The woman question was a part of that broader revolution, as it was declared. The woman's question was a key ideological concern of this revolutionary struggle, reforming the state and shirking off the imperial yoke, as in other post-colonial societies, let's say India, that this would take place on women's bodies, right? So women's bodies have been integral to the establishment of the Islamic Republic of Iran. So what I argued in my first book was that two things simultaneously happened. On the one hand, women's rights, which were defined as freedom from, capitalist and imperialist exploitation, would forever be bound with this revolutionary struggle. And we all know that the Inqilab Islami, the Islamic Revolution, is in Iran's constitution. So two things happened. So as I said, the first one was that women's rights were forever bound with the revolutionary struggle that established this Islamic Republic. But the second point, which emerges from this first point, is that women in post-revolutionary Iran were now made to have expectations for those rights, those freedoms, and dignity that made them the key ideological symbols of the revolutionary struggle. And this was a discursive move, but it was also a materialist move, that women were now looking for tangible results from this. The other thing, many of you have, written about this, heard about this, but the idea of the chador, the black full covering tent-like garment, was a very important ideological locator of this new country. And one member of the ulama, Ayatollah Taleghani, whose daughter was a very progressive reformist later on, but Ayatollah Taleghani in 1982 said, we want the Iranian women to don this chador to show the world that something has changed. So they took it up initially as a very important element. So it speaks to why it's so difficult now to challenge it, but it also speaks to the myriad concerns that have coalesced around this compulsion. If we're forced to wear the headscarf, where are our rights? Where is our dignity? Where is our liberty? Where is our food? Where are not just women's rights, as others have said, but where are all of these anti-imperialist promises that sparked the revolution and the protests that included so much of Iran's population at that time?
Does anybody else want to jump on that element of it as sort of what have women been doing historically? What is the history there in terms of what women have been doing on other fronts besides being on the street? And maybe I'll direct the forms of like cultural contestation and protest towards Nahid, if you're willing to take it up. Sort of what are the broader ways women have been asserting their voices, and then even beyond women's rights, how have people been sort of trying to create spaces of political dissent through other means?
Sure, thank you. There is more to be said in the legal realm, and I hope we can get back to that a little bit. But all the organizing and campaigning that's happened over the last 40 years and so on. And one that people often talk about is the 1 million signatures campaign. I think it's an important one to talk about because of its sort of lack of focus on the hijab, actually. But focus on other important elements. But in terms of the cultural realm, I think what we see over the last 40 years, but especially I would say, over the last, as far as filmmakers are concerned, right? Iran has more female film directors than most Western countries. And in their productions, you see real critical, representations of gender relations in Iran, gender equality. So all of that work's has been done, by somebody like Rakhshana Bani Etemad, Milani. All these people have been putting work out there, these female film directors that have been viewed by Iranians in Iran, in Iranian cinemas. And so people have been engaging with these questions in the cultural realm. But especially since the sort of onset of the internet, but specifically sort of the social media aspect of it over the last decade, what we see is that this the cultural regulations that have been applied to certain realms affecting women, such as the ban on solo female singing, right? All these sort of regulations have been taken down on social media. So what we see in the public sphere is a different picture than the presentation we've seen on social media. And so over the last 10 years, the Iran that we see is a different one than the Iran that is permitted. So there's this huge rift between what the government officially is allowed to permit and the sort of everyday mundane life that Iranian women have been carrying on, whether as musicians or in their private spheres. And so the distribution and mediation of these everyday acts of whether it's singing in your kitchen or highly polished, actually, music videos with solo female vocals. And more recently, over the last 3-4 years, of women very much sort of, taking, sort of untethering their bodies from state control in very sort of public, spontaneous acts of dancing on the streets. So we've seen this happening on social media, on this sort of sphere independent from state control, that the majority of Iranians partaking, like everybody else, and not everybody else, but most people who have access to electricity and phones and the internet in the world, right? They've been living their lives partly on social media and engaging in this other sphere, which I think has gradually just allowed for this spillover from that life that people have been living quite publicly on social media, not in the physical spaces of the Islamic Republic, into the public sphere, right? Sort of this breaking down of barriers of what is permissible, what is possible, what is already part of everyday life. And I think that's something important that we need to sort of keep in mind when we talk about how have we come to this moment? How has this been made possible? And I think we do need to really factor in this alternative sort of life on social media that Iranians have been engaging in over the last decade.
I wanted just to say a quick thing, kind of connecting what Arzu and Nahid are saying about, the ways in which women drew on the promises made to them, the kind of post-revolutionary decades, and then the sort of everyday. And I think that the 1 million signatures campaign, which emerges in 2006 after several years of pushing for reforms in family law, brings those together really nicely, because it both says, look, we were promised that this is a new society, right? That Islam was about honoring women's equality, right? and the vision of this sort of equality in these gender differentiated terms doesn't work for us. So we want to talk about, right, our vision of equality. And also, I think importantly, brought the everyday, right, the shifts in consciousness, the fact that in people's homes, they were struggling around gender roles, right? The fact that younger people were having a new vision of sort of gender equality and justice. And the campaign, in my estimation, really drew on that and said, look, right, things have shifted. Women have a vibrant presence in society. They are political actors. They have been mobilizing, before the revolution, but certainly in the post-revolutionary period. And the sort of presence of women, this idea that women are social actors, that they're agents in their society, that they are, highly educated, that the revolution gave them that in many ways, that new groups of women came out to society. So it doesn't make sense to have these discriminatory laws, was part of the way in which that was argued. And I think that that was a really a moving and interesting campaign to sort of, on the one hand, very pragmatic, thinking about, there is this space, and there was more space in certain, governments than others in certain periods, to reform law. And there were some victories. I think it's important to say that there were some victories. But now I lost my train of thought. To say that that it's a kind of pragmatic, reform-oriented movement, but it reflects something deeper about the ways in which people have changed around this question and our desire, right? Women's equality, not just women, but other people in the society, right? And that there was a kind of sense in bringing that widespread desire of the society to a reform campaign, I think reflected all of what people were just talking about.
And if I can jump on that for a minute to bring it back to Arzu, there's also, there's the 1 million women's signature campaign. There's these big sort of reform-oriented movements where women are placing themselves. And then there's these cultural forms that Nahid is also speaking to. But then there's quieter forms and sort of everyday forms that women are asserting themselves in the legal system, whether that's in family court or in, cases you've worked on murder and forgiveness and those sorts of ways that women are really asserting themselves in these really powerful ways legally in Iran. If you can just, touch on that as well, Arzu.
Oh, yes, thank you. I don't want to talk too much when it was my turn. So I want to remind everyone that the Islamic Republic is an innovation. It's an experiment. And many, many of the activists, the nationalists, the people involved in the revolution that brought about this formation didn't really know what they were doing. I mean, they didn't know what they were going to end up with. And it was part of a broader compromise. But what it did give people was these branches of government, a legislative branch of government, a judiciary. And I'm not saying those things didn't exist before, but with this sort of sheen of concession or accession to Islam, right? And now what people were fighting for was through legal and constitutional support to make good on the promises of this post-revolutionary constitution. And one of the ways that this was happening when I was in Iran, again, starting in the late 90s, was fighting for reform through judicial activism, in the legislature, in the courts, and everyday people going to court. And one thing that I observed was that because of the sort of discriminatory interpretations of some of these laws, we come to find that the Sharia is highly interpretable. Who knew? Because the Constitution states that there's gender equality. Women and men are equal, which, by the way, the US Constitution doesn't have. Many post-colonial constitutions have this great language. So women were realizing that, wait a second, I don't have these things. What was really interesting was that women had to go to court, let's say, to file grievances against a husband or someone. And what they realized was they needed to build a case. But the men, they didn't need a reason in this interpretation of the Sharia back then to get a divorce. So what was the effect of this? Well, this forced women, like housewives, women living at home, working out inside the home, to read Iran's civil code on marriage and family. Little by little, women gained tremendous legal knowledge, not to mention skill. Women were deeply skilled at making legal claims and filing petitions in court. One of my venues of doing fieldwork was the Jalase Quran, or Quranic scriptural reading groups, which many of you know have been going on in Iran for centuries, and not just in Iran. But what I was really struck by was the way that these women were inserting what I would call feminist readings into their reading of the Quran, and Republican, with a small r, readings into the Quran, saying we're individuals. We're not supposed to have a mediated relationship with God. We can't expect somebody else to tell us what all of this means. So at this Jalase Quran, this Quranic scriptural reading group, they read the Quran, but they also, like, they had a woman lawyer come and tell women how to file a complaint to get a divorce, like how much you have to pay to get the right kind of filing fees. They also had women politicians come and talk about how to do voting blocks for parliamentarians. So these early post-war with Iraq to the mid-2000s, I would say, was a very exciting time in Iran, because coalitions made up of women, but also men, were coming together to push for legal reform, coming in from the ground floor. And so we saw women making claims before judges in courts, winning decisive decisions. When I went back, so if I did my big fieldwork in 2000, when I went back in 2000 and I don't know, 6 or 7, I met with one of these women lawyers. And I said, well, what do you think about women's rights now? And she said, oh, before women didn't know their rights. Now they know them too well. So there has been a lot of legal reform, to the point where if men don't, after a divorce, if men don't pay the bride price that is required of them, they can go to jail. And I have met in 2019, the last time I was in Iran, I met so many men who were so angry because either they had spent time in jail or were going to jail because they didn't pay this decisive award. And at that time, the government was looking into how to change it, because women had become too powerful, because they had been this Islamic Republic system, which kind of made it easy for men, forced women to become legal advocates for their own cases. And they did it so well that the reforms there has been somewhat of a backlash. To my knowledge, that law has not yet changed. However, some things have changed. Men now do need to go to court to get a divorce. They have to state a reason, even though according to that interpretation of the Shah, they're not supposed to need one. There were rules about child custody. Women fought, and that was another issue in 1998, when custody of young children, boys starting at 2 and girls at the age of 7, would automatically be given to a man, the father, for economic logics, much more than otherwise. But what was really interesting about this was that there was another issue where a child was killed, in this case by her father, by her drug addict, abusive father. And this was a spark that allowed the law to change. So there have been judicial reforms, but some of these really important judicial activists, like Fazeh Hashemi, the daughter of Rafsanjani, who was a member of one of the early parliaments, who has now, when I went to Iran for the first time, she had a newspaper, a daily, called Zan. I mean, how many countries in the world have a daily newspaper just dedicated to women's issues? so these changes in, you wanted me to talk about the legal reforms. The legal reforms in divorce have been very important for women's lives. Custody battles have been important. A lot of the things that people say, let's say when someone is murdered in Iran, there's a compensation that's paid. People say, oh, women's is half of men's. That's actually been adjusted. So many people don't know this, but in the criminal codes, there is a provision where one can petition the government to pay that other half. So women's diye, or compensation, is no longer, they try to find these workarounds. So the Islamic Republic says, well, this is in the Sharia, we can't change it. But what they do is they add a procedural reform that says, okay, you can petition the government. So we're not disrupting our interpretation of the Sharia, we're still Islamic, but we're going to allow a procedural fix for this. And we see this with automobile accidents as well, where if it used to be that if a man were killed, because he's the breadwinner ostensibly, the payout is twice, or is whole, let's say, for one person, whereas the payout for a woman driver who is killed in an auto accident would have been half. Now that's been fixed. The government actually does force all insurance companies, and the government itself will pay that extra half, so to speak. So there are these legal workarounds. Obviously, the laws in place that still privilege patriarchal governance are being challenged. And that's what I think is really important. And I hope that we can go back to Catherine's point about the issue of the importance of bodily integrity. And I know we're going to talk about the West, but I think I didn't used to hear it as much of it was much more of an issue of, oh, do I have to wear the headscarf? It's not the most important thing in my life. I much rather get my rights in marriage and divorce and child custody and what legal rights. But now that's changed to something about, I have a right to bodily autonomy. I have a right to individual rights. And again, these are consecrated in Iran's post-revolutionary discourse, in Iran's constitution, and in Iran's civil codes, which make everyone an individual. So I'm interested in this new expression of bodily integrity as the basis for these protests. And I think it's really important to think about how men have now become involved. If I could just say one last thing, is that I remember once I was going to Iran, and for anyone who's been to Iran, you know that when you land, the flight attendants come out and say, oh, this is the Islamic Republic of Iran. By law, you all have to put on your headscarf. And a gentleman sitting next to me, this was like in 2005, turned to me and said, oh, I'm so sorry for you. And I said, why are you sorry for me? I feel sorry for you. And he's like, but what do you mean? Like, kind of, I'm free. And I said, what does this say about you? That I'm forced to cover my head for you? So I think that there is we talk about women's awakening, but I think there's much more of an awakening about bodily integrity as related to men as well, because women have been aware of these challenges for centuries, I would say. So sorry for speaking so long.
No, I'm glad you brought that back. And I also, there was a question from the audience that relates to this as well. And so I'm going to tie it in to the second part of the question I'm going to ask about transnational solidarity. So thank you for bringing us full circle. Those are really important for people to understand the multiple ways that these struggles are being fought and enacted. And they're not limited to the street, but the street right now is where we're at. And we want to talk about what that means for the women of Iran in this moment. So to now come back, I want to ask Manija and Catherine in particular. Iranians have been calling for international solidarity, and I'm talking about Iranians inside Iran. What are the possibilities for building a transnational feminist movement in support of the uprising in Iran, and what are the challenges to that?
Maybe I'll start and then turn over to Catherine. So I think it's really important, really significant that there is a call from so many Iranians who are risking their lives right now for international solidarity. And I think in order to really take that seriously and put that into practice, there's a few things that we need to be clear about for those of us who are not in Iran, and especially those of us who are in places like the United States, which have been, targeting Iran in so many ways for over 40 years. So I think we have to be clear that this is an uprising of Iranian people who want to get rid of their repressive government, right? So they want to choose their future and their government for themselves. So first and foremost, this is about self-determination, right? Not a call for, intervention by Western governments or states and things like that. So I think standing in solidarity means recognizing that what's happening on the ground in Iran right now is historic. And it should serve as an inspiration to feminists and social justice activists everywhere who are engaged in so many different struggles against patriarchal violence, against police state violence, mass incarceration, censorship, and efforts by so many different kinds of right-wing forces to control women's bodily autonomy, to deny women and queer and trans people full equality in their societies, right? So I think that Iranians in the streets, they want to know that people everywhere care what happens to them. They're very isolated and they're being arrested and shot. They're really risking their lives. The internet is shut down for much of the day, as people know. So I think in the face of that kind of state violence, our weapon is solidarity, right? It's kind of all we actually have, if you really think about it, And I was reminded of the slogan, "The whole world is watching," which I think was first chanted by Americans who were protesting the Vietnam War in 1968, and they were being beaten up by police. And they wanted to call attention to the state violence, the violent suppression of this very legitimate dissent. And I think that slogan, what would it mean to bring that sentiment to bear on Iran right now? We want the whole world to be watching, right? How the police and the military behave, to be posting videos, denouncing the violence. We want to apply pressure from below internationally, right, against the Iranian regime, not to use mass force, not to, use that horrible, option, right? To stop shooting and arresting people right now. So I think we have to organize outside Iran to make it a reality that any mass crackdown there would ignite a popular global uproar, And so to me, that's really in some ways the most important thing that those of us outside of Iran can do right now.
I mean, that's beautiful. I don't know really what to add. I think that's so important. And I think to frame this as part of a global movement, right? That there have been global uprisings for the last couple of decades, that this is its own uprising, and it should be seen as its own uprising with particular characteristics and aspirations and goals, but it's part of a kind of epochal shift that I think is, there are many people, including us in the US, who are fed up with, right, the kinds of politics as usual, and who feel that we need more substantial, deeper changes that reflect our desires. And I think this is a kind of sentiment in many, many places. And so, yes, I think sovereignty is key. And I think that, we have to, we say different things in different spaces, but I think it's really important in all of the spaces to say that the sort of sovereignty of the people and the sovereignty of gendered subjects who are demanding that the kind of particular ways in which, the state security is inscribed on their bodies is not okay, that you can say those things together, we sort of said this at the very beginning, right? That these things will not be separated, that we will not allow them, we don't allow a choice between one or the other, that the sort of bodily dissent of women and others is part of this larger struggle, and that we have to, those forms of sovereignty come together and are, absolutely indivisible. And I think this is happening in different places, in different kinds of ways. So I think to really focus on, Iran as part of the world, and Manijeh is absolutely right. I think we must learn from this. We must listen. We must talk about it. This is an incredible example of something that is unfolding that I think will have ramifications and should have ramifications for everyone, no matter where they're situated.
I just wanted to add one thing about the new forms of solidarity that are coming not only from Iranian diaspora, but also independent feminist groups from other places. And I think that's something to celebrate and see that they are recognizing and acknowledging the very contextual and local specificities of the Iranian women's movement, but at the same time finding ways to connect it to their own movement, coming from Chile, the Philippines, Afghan, Turkish women, Lebanese and Iraqi women. And I just wanted to read 2 lines from the Afghan women's statement of solidarity with Iranians, because I think it touches upon something that would connect all these women who are fighting against the same thing in different shades and forms together. It says, we women of Afghanistan, as well as a number of people and groups supporting gender equality, decisively signed this statement to express our belief that each and every government around the world, whether in so-called democratic or dictatorial form, have placed the deprivation and condemnation of women as their priority. And this refers to nothing but patriarchy and its ruling system in the whole world. We object to such a system and will never reduce it to a national government. So I think it's really important to see this coming from especially Afghan women, going through very similar things. And the statement is long and beautifully talks about the overlapping aspects of the Afghan and Iranian women's fight, but at the same time saying that this is not about Islamic autocracy, not Islam for sure, but Islamic autocracy or Islamic government. And this is not specifically about Iran or Afghanistan or the Middle East, but it can actually go beyond those boundaries. So I think this is a powerful way of thinking about how solidarity can be built without forgetting about the specificities, but at the same time keeping it independent and autonomous from hijacking movements that already exist forever, especially when it comes to Iran and its last for decades. So.
This relates to a question from one of our viewers, Maya, who asked, you spoke of these protests in terms of a feminist framework of bodily and political rights. How might these protests and demands be put into conversation with global crackdowns and feminist resistance on the question of bodily and political rights? And then most of you have sort of touched on that, but this last part is where I wanted you to focus next, is in what other ways are women's / people's bodies regulated in Iran? So maybe you guys can tease that out a little bit as well. So how does this relate to sort of what's happening globally, but then also what is specifically happening in Iran in terms of bodily, how the body is being regulated?
I can speak briefly to that. The body is being regulated not just in terms of hijab, but also, and people have done work on this in terms of comportment in the public space, so that that is why these viral dance videos that we've seen over the last few years are so important, because certain kinds of comportment have not been considered to be appropriate or not exactly sort of within the committed or revolutionary discourse of the state as to what is appropriate in terms of how one comports oneself in the public space. And this applies also to men, by the way, and to young men. And that's why every sort of once in a while, every couple of years, we'll see these very huge blowouts of especially very young people engaging in this, precisely sort of pushing back against that those kinds of moral impositions on what is acceptable and what is not acceptable within the public and sort of ethical space, and engaging in whether it's water fights or skateboarding contests, very public ones. And I think, since I'm mentioning these events that really involve mostly very young people, something that we haven't really pointed out is that, and this is something that we hear from people in Iran over the last 11, 12 days, that there is a real majority of very young people in these protests, right? 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds, who somehow are not really bound or beholden to these to the discourses that Iranians of perhaps older generations are somehow conditioned to be responsive to, whether it's through their education as a kid, having gone through primary schooling in Iran in the 80s, this sort of feeling of indebtedness and guilt towards the blood of the martyrs in the Iran-Iraq war. And these are not to be taken lightly, right? The way in which Iranians are conditioned over decades to feel a certain way toward for themselves and toward their society and toward their state. And so I think it's not surprising that the kinds of boundary breaking that we see have been coming from sort of a much younger generation who are less beholden to these discourses, not least because because their lives have been so much more interconnected. So when we talk about transnational solidarity, or just think about sort of the global context, because their lives have been just much more interconnected globally with young lives elsewhere, and they're consuming, spending half their lives on social media and consuming all kinds of videos, whether it's on TikTok or elsewhere, and contributing to them. And so they've sort of managed to somehow surpass this space that I think older generations perhaps couldn't so easily surpass. And which is why also another sort of unique aspect of these protests, this goes back to the first question, is that, from the very beginning, the demands were clear. So this was not one where people sort of slowly grew into saying, down with the dictator, or, we don't want this regime. This was there from the very beginning.
And if I can add, I think the other thing that we see, because of the generational component, that, thank you, Nahid, for bringing that into the center, it's so important, is that there's really no concern, or that, like, there's not a worry about how this will be read in the West, or how this might feed into Islamophobia in the West. That's just, people don't care. They want their freedom, they want their liberation, they don't want mandatory hijab, and they don't want a religious government, right? And they're not concerned with how that plays, but I think I'm raising this because I see a question in the chat from Parisa: how do you center Iran and Iranian women in this conversation when talking to non-Iranians in the US without being forced into the fold of Islamophobia and anti-Middle Eastern racism? And I think this is so important, not because we always need to worry about how everything is seen in the US, but because we want to build international solidarity. And if you want to build international solidarity or transnational feminist solidarity, you have to actually be able to address these issues, right? And you have to actually be able to talk to people in the United States and explain that this is absolutely about hijab, but it's about hijab in an Iranian context. It's about the state forcing women to wear hijab, and that making them vulnerable constantly to state violence and harassment, right? And preventing their full equality in the society. It is not about hijab everywhere, all the time, in every country and context. It is not about a universal hijab, which doesn't exist, right? It is about hijab in Iran. And we don't have to be squeamish about that. We have to be absolutely clear, because that is the clarity on the streets in Iran, and that is the demand in Iran. But what I tried to say, yesterday I was teaching, I have many students who wear hijab, and I said to them, the same way that we have to defend the right of Iranian women not to be forced to wear hijab is the same way we would have to march here to defend your right to wear hijab, right? That it depends on the context, but there has to be a clarity around opposing the state from controlling women's bodies, right? That has to be the unifying. And I think that can be the basis for international solidarity, because that is what resonates. You know, the outrage that women in America felt when Roe v. Wade was overturned, like that idea that the state is going to tell me what I get to do. I mean, okay, you know, we have our version of that rage, you know, where we want to go into the streets, and actually I think we're not as advanced as people in Iran in terms of figuring out how to, you know, really resist our own patriarchal authoritarian elements, you know, here. But I think we just have to be really clear that, you know, this is not about, I mean, there are so many people on the streets of Iran who are saying, you know, they're doing these things in the name of Islam. This is not my Islam, you know? So, you know, this is a fight about, you know, about how people want to actually live. It's, you know, and it's not a religious versus secular. I don't even think that's accurate, although many people in Iran want a secular government, but they're not anti-Islam, right? People are horrified about what's being done in the name of their faith and in the name of their religion, and they very much want to take it away from the state, you know, having a monopoly on defining Islam.
And that has been true for a very long time. You know, that has been true for a very long time. And I would just add too, I think I've been really struck by this uprising, looking at it sort of side by side with a lot of Russian men fleeing conscription, you know, and thinking about, without going, you know, abstracting it too much, but really making these connections with our students in particular, that, you know, no matter what the form of the state is, it requires a certain compulsion that is gendered and racialized and you know, about sexuality and class and all of those things, and that people are again dissenting, right, in their bodies. They are moving away from those compulsions of all kinds, right, to connect to connect these compulsions, while also, right, not sort of taking away from the very specific nature of this kind of bodily dissent.
I'm going to hand it off to Bassam, who wants to make a point, and then we are going to actually directly address this question of, you know, how the protests situate themselves within this broader global context. So, Bassam.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Nigar, and everyone. I have been listening and happy to yield to this whole discussion because of how remarkable it has been. But before we move forward and before I address the global context, I would like to share that the person who asked the question that Nigar shared is Maya Megdashi, who will actually be speaking at George Mason and, of course, here on Jadaliyya/ASI on Friday. Also online, I will share very quickly the announcement. I'm not sure if you'll be able to see it, but let's see. So this will be broadcast live at 1 p.m. this Friday. This is Maya's book on which just came out from Stanford on sectarianism, sovereignty, secularism, and the state in Lebanon. And I hope you all can join us because it is another, I presume, another form of continuing the conversation along very similar lines. So please join us Friday at 12 p.m. or sorry, at 1 p.m. Eastern time for this conversation. And I'll now move to addressing the global question, which is always a thorny question when it comes to states like Iran and Syria because of the multiple and overlapping contentions. And the question basically, it's a series of questions, and I hope that we can have a discussion about it so that we can address the different dimensions. So can we acknowledge how Iran, basically, can we acknowledge the broader political global context without centering the West always, given that, the Iranian diaspora is actually spread out throughout the West, and Iran itself exists in a very broad and contentious context. And in relation to that, how much and to what extent can we talk about what's happening inside Iran right now without taking into account how it's being portrayed or represented in US media in particular, but also Western media more generally, and to or for Western audiences. So if we can just address these issues, and feel free to take any tangents that are not included in these questions. Thank you.
I would like to say something about that. One thing that has come out of this conversation, but also just watching what's happening inside Iran, is that there's a tremendous sense of fed upness, right? And I think that that is not exclusive to Iran or the regime, as people say, the government in Iran, but it is actually an effect of the geopolitical context and flows of capital from global south to north. And then we can see the same with forced migration. But what I'm trying to get at is that we are seeing challenges to the nation state system. We see individuals who are seeking a new articulation of the relationship between human rights and the state's responsibility towards people. And I think that's something that we can not just attribute to a patriarchal government in Iran, but also to cases of humanitarian catastrophes that are happening because of the global climate disaster, because of structural adjustment in societies that have had problems, paying back their World Bank loans. And what we're seeing is an increase in humanitarian types of care. So governments are now doling out benefits or giving handouts because of the very systems that have now impoverished people. And Iran is a great example because it's a society in which people are at experiencing humanitarian crisis at the hands of international actors, direct pressure from the US in the form of so-called maximum pressure, but also within their own context. So we see increasingly around the world these humanitarian situations that call for care, and people are saying, we don't want your benevolence, man. We want our rights. So I think that this kind of articulation is something important in this era to for scholars in particular who study this stuff to really latch onto and think about more completely, I guess.
Maybe I can respond to the question of the diaspora. I think the question of the diaspora, as much as we want to keep the conversation to sort of focused on Iran, I think the question of the diaspora is a very important one when it comes to the Iranian context, because as we know, there are millions of Iranians of various sort of degrees of departure from Iran, right? So there are some who very recently left Iran. There's some who left Iran at, following the 2009 Green Movement, others who left 20 years ago, and others. So you have this sort of, a very sort of staggered wave of Iranian diasporic communities abroad. And given the fairly close media system within Iran itself, I don't think some of these conversations would have been able to been had so easily without the establishment of some of these diasporic expat television channels, which many Iranians, that's where their source of news is, depending on sort of their preferences, whether it's BBC Persian or Iran International or whatnot. But they do, a large number of Iranians do receive their information, from these expat television news programs. And I think sort of the question of media is an important one when we consider, what is the role of the diaspora? And I think it can be quite, disruptive and even damaging at times. And we've seen this with other sort of situations where, certain people will play into the hands of the West trying to portray the movement in Iran in a certain light, sometimes or oftentimes kind of in a, very sort of, pathological or like sad way, which is sort of the representation that I've seen that I most dislike, because, what's happening in Iran is defiant, and it's, if not directly joyous, it's certainly, very energetic, and sort of this representation that we see often in Western media of these like poor Iranian women who have been repressed. And, the narrative and the story we need to tell is the opposite of that. It's the story of how Iranian women over the course of the last 40 years, over the course of, the last 100 years, you can even go back, further to Qurratul Ain, who like in the 1850s, I think, at her execution, because of unveiling, said, you can kill me as soon as you want, but you won't be able to stop women's emancipation. It's a very hopeful one, actually. And I think the arc of it is, leading us to a bright place. But anyway, I don't know where I'm going with this. I'll shut up.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just jump in and say, I think we do really have to talk about the transnational and the global, because he's making those connections. He's saying, oh, he's screaming at the UN, you want to talk about state violence? The US is, one of the biggest promoters of police brutality, which of course he's right, but that's not his message, right? That's activist message. So we can't concede that ground. And, the other vision of transnational solidarity is not our friend at all, Elon Musk, right? Giving Starlink, which is, spreading malware, which I think is an appropriate sort of metaphor or something. So I think that we can't concede that. We have to worry about the fraught nature of all of these discussions, but we have to put another narrative out there, that we've been trying to outline. We can't concede the ground, and we don't have obviously control over the many narratives that are out there, but I think we have to build a robust vision of solidarity that Manijay, I think, has outlined, that is meaningful to people everywhere, and really think about the fact that there is something different about the global uprisings of the last many years in terms of they're largely leaderless, and this is an incredible strength. It's beautiful, and an incredible weakness too. And I think we have wrestled with that in our own context with Occupy Wall Street, and with many of the kind of uprisings that we're trying to figure out how do you scale them up to more systemic change. Does it mean a different kind of state? Does it mean no state? What does it mean? These are debates that people are having in their societies. And I think there's lots of connections across many regions of the world that we can pull out and draw out and have those debates.
And just on that note, I just want to put in a plug for, actually, there's a call for an International Day of Feminist Solidarity with the uprising in Iran for this Sunday, October 2nd. And hopefully in cities and countries all around the world, we very much hope people will respond to that call, not just Iranians in diaspora, but again, feminist social justice activists in countries around the world who can recognize in the uprising in Iran something that resonates deeply with their own desires for liberation, right? And who want to uplift that struggle and make sure that we're all paying attention and learning and following and supporting what's happening in Iran. So Sunday, October 2nd is that feminist call for transnational solidarity. And I think globally, our forces, our ability to really do transnational solidarity has been very, very weakened by intense levels of state repression. I think that's something that's true in so many parts of the world, that we have weak lefts, we have weak feminist movements, we have, it's not true everywhere, but, that there is, if we can't imagine a kind of alternative to the international community of nation states, if we can't imagine another force in the world that we can turn to when things like this happen to apply so-called pressure on the Iranian government, then I think people end up back in the dead end of wishing that global, that nation states were going to come to their aid in a sort of benevolent way. So I think the onus is really upon us, and people all over the world to continue to work to build that alternative, that third force, right? That force of solidarity from below.
Well, we're really coming to the end of our time here, and I want to give everybody an opportunity to sort of talk about what lays ahead, which is in some ways the most difficult and terrible question to put on anybody when it comes to a country like Iran, is to, what lays ahead. And I think there's been a few questions from the audience in terms of like, does this mean removing of the mandatory hijab? Does this mean like complete change on the ground? What comes next, in other words? And we don't have a lot of time, so unfortunately I'm going to pass it to all of you, but if you can just be mindful of time when you answer, that would be great. So Furu, why don't you start?
I think nobody can. I don't think anybody has the right to even assume a future for this movement, especially considering its multiplicity that we've been talking about for an hour and a half now. And I think one thing that I want to mention is that the state's repression is getting intensified these days. The last 2 days, 3 days have been a lot worse. I have not heard back from my family for more than 24 hours now. The internet shutdown is real, and the troops are in the streets. There are tanks, military tanks in the streets now. And I think the most recent kind of like turn in the events has been the call for national strikes, which first started in Kurdistan, and that was through more like, let's say, ethnic nationalistic groups through Kurdistan, and there was a lot of resistance against it because a lot of Kurdish communities were also pushing against the idea of making it about Kurdistan, and it already was out of the picture after 2 days. Now it's national strikes, and I think this is something to take seriously and think about as another step towards that solidarity that is being built among generations of women with other people of Iran. And at the same time, think about how from the image of Mahsa Amini, we are moving on to seeing all these other images coming out. And it's not just one face. And yes, it is leaderless, but at the same time, it's like multiple people joining this image and adding color to the basically the first image of the revolution, I would call it now. And I think we need to also recognize the fact that a lot of different factions and groups from within Iran and diaspora and Iranian diaspora outside are calling it a revolution intentionally as a way of showing solidarity with the national strikes, and also this basically thinking about the fact that only 11 days passed. This is this widespread, not only within Iran, but outside. This is just to celebrate. And also, I think, just to end my notes quickly, I think uprisings and revolutions are about imagining different futures. And that already is happening for a long time in Iran, but right now so powerfully that this will not be forgotten, and it will be leading us to different avenues wherever it would be. So
if I could just say one thing quickly. I love Furu's attention to the global, and I want to say at issue is basically an alleged murder at the very, very spark of it, right? At the very ground level. And the governments all around the world, when there are these kinds of uprisings, seek a face-saving kind of, not a resolution or a solution even, but just a way to lessen the pressure on them. So there's going to be a murder trial, right? There's going to be some kind of very small accountability offered up. And there's going to be some way that this is they're going to try to channel this through existing legal channels to say, look, we're following our own laws, and we can handle, we're not a failed state, right? We have a working state system. So there's going to be some of that, I think, too. But I agree, never speculate. It's wrong to speculate.
Yeah, if I might chime in, agreed. And what we're basically seeing is the state doing what it's always done. So it's already trying to spin the narrative. So we're now seeing on state television the narrative that this is all kind of the work of the Kurdish Democratic Party, that the Kurd separatists are kind of behind driving this movement, trying to bring about a rift among Iranian protesters. And as far as there was a question, there were two questions about, is it likely that the state might renege on the imposition of the compulsory hijab? And I would say we have no reason to believe that. We have no reason to believe that might be the case, not least because of these, sort of the extreme repression that's already happening on the streets, and we don't know the half of it because of the internet shutdown, but also because it's had the option of doing it in other spheres over the last 10 years. Part of my research is about solo female singing. And even though there's no law that forbids solo female vocals, these women at the very end were taken to court, charged with collaboration with foreign media, and never given the right to sing, which would appear to be such a small issue. But I think this is, again, about sort of this, symbolic, upholding a certain image or ideology of the Islamic Republic, which at the end is very much tied to a certain representation of the female body.
Yeah, I'll just chime in and echo. We don't know. There's no blueprint, and that's a good thing, and also a nerve-wracking thing. We're all holding our breath, and I think whatever happens, we can be assured that there are lots of people who want a different kind of present and a different kind of future, one deeply, deeply informed by feminism, and a lot of that feminism from the global South. So.
Manija, final words?
Okay, I feel like I talked so much. I guess I've just been thinking about, whatever happens, how struggle transforms human beings, and the ways that people find each other in the streets, and the ways that they're transformed forever, right, by the experience of defying state power, of doing the so supposedly impossible, right, of resisting incredible militarism and violence through unity, and just thinking about all the thousands and thousands of people who are participating in this, and how they're being forever transformed by this. And I think that revolutionary experience and revolutionary consciousness will remain and will continue, no matter what the exact outcomes are that we can't possibly predict.
What a great way to end this conversation. Well, thank you so much to everybody who tuned in. We had a sizable audience on all our platforms. Thank you to Arzu, Catherine, Furul, Nahid, and Manija so much for imparting your wisdom and your expertise on this really complicated, unfolding issue. It's not easy to talk about the present. And if we had more time, we'd talk about how difficult it is to do these things when you're so invested personally also in what's happening, just the weight of all of that. So thank you for taking the time in the midst of all of this to share your knowledge and expertise. Bassam, I don't know if you have any final words as well.
Yes, I'd like to thank everyone for this remarkable conversation. You might have seen me. I've been trying to also manage with the MK some of the questions and some of the developments online, and everyone has expressed their gratitude, and everyone was very excited to be here. And actually, I don't think they wanted to end, but we have to let you go because you have lives. And I wanted to say before we break, thanks to everyone, and thanks to Nigar for basically, moderating this important discussion, and thanks to MK for putting us online everywhere. Before we break, I just also want to say that we have tomorrow another broadcast at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time with Abdullah Al-Aryan, who teaches at Georgetown, Qatar. And he will be talking about a new book on football and politics and state politics in the Middle East. At 12 again Eastern Time. And on Friday we have Maya Magdashi from Rutgers speaking on her recent book, also Sectarianism. So I hope you can join us. Thanks to all our sponsors and to everyone watching. This will be also made available online as a separate video aside from the feed. And I hope we can speak with you soon under better circumstances, though something tells me that those circumstances will take some time. Shukran, and have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you both. And thank you to everyone at Jadaliyya and Bassam and Negar and my co-panelists.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
everyone.
Thank you so much.
So much.
Bye.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum.